Don't step over there.
I think you can use that. They're so tall, you could put it in there.
I don't know, can you hear me?
Sure.
I'd rather not use it if I didn't have to. Well, I want to give you a little background on the parents before they finally got to the homestead. Barbara and Chris Christensen migrated from Denmark in 1907. They had 3 children, Bob, Charlie, and Roosevelt. They called him Rosie. It took them 3 weeks to get across the Atlantic from Denmark to New York. And when they got into the New York harbor, they wanted to see the Statue of Liberty because that's always the big thrill. And so they huddled up on the deck, and when they glided by, they thought they heard her saying, "Give me your tired and your poor, yearning to become free, and bring me your homeless, and I will lift my lamp and light the golden door." Well, it seemed like she was really talking to them, that they were tired, they were poor, and they were huddled there with tears streaming down their faces because this was an emotional thing, a very emotional experience. And they were homeless, but not for long, because they had a dream, and they were rich in faith, love, ambition, and courage. And they'd make it because they were my mom and dad. They quickly dried their tears and waited in line to disembark. The next stop was Ellis Island. And as they walked through those golden doors, as did 1,000,000 other people that year, and they hurriedly found seats on a hard bench and waited for the inspector to call their name. And the children played around for a while, and then they crawled up on the benches and went to sleep. They were just little tots. And Dad held Mom's hand to reassure her and tell her that everything's going to be all right. And then he leaned back and he was thinking of an earlier time when he came from Denmark, when he was young and carefree. But this was different. Now he had responsibility. He was married with a wife and 3 children and another one on the way. And what was Mom thinking? Well, she was remembering when she was young. She was 18 and her sister was 20. And they were on their way to Chicago, and they were going to be nannies to some rich Americans. Well, they were awakened from their thoughts when the inspector called, "Christian, Carl, Christensen family, come to the inspector's booth." So they hurriedly went to the inspector's booth, and they were medically examined. And then they had to show their credentials and then answer the questions that was necessary. And then they were dismissed. So they left and hurried to the train depot and again sat on hard benches and waited for the next train going west to South Dakota. They got to South Dakota, and Mom's brother was there to meet them. And he had migrated a number of years before. And he took them to their home, to his home, and they stayed there until Dad could find a little house to rent. And he got a job as a meat cutter. And they stayed there for 11 months. In February, Brother Harold was born, the first little citizen. That was in 1908. They stayed there until he was 5 months old, and then they started for Kennewick. They arrived in Kennewick on a very hot summer day. And when they got there, Dad's cousin, Tom Christensen, was there to meet them, and a very dear friend, by the name of Pete Matson. Tom took them to his home, and they stayed there until Dad could rent a little house on 2nd Street between Washington and Auburn. And there they lived for several years. And Pete Matson was instrumental in helping Dad open a meat market. And it was located probably in the parking lot of old Henry's little cafe. And the market was doing pretty well. Even though he didn't speak much English, they seemed to be able to communicate. And he had lots of the homesteaders come in and buy meat from him. There were the Omans and the Pullens and the Sweeneys, different ones. And Pete was a bachelor, so he spent a lot of time visiting with the parents. And so he said, one day over a cup of coffee, Mom was always making coffee, over a cup of coffee, he said, you know, Barbara, I'm really concerned. What's going to happen to me when I get old? I don't have any family. And if I get sick, I don't know what will happen. Oh, she said, Pete, don't worry about that. She said, when you get sick, she said, I'll take care of you. But he was happy. That gave him a lot of comfort. And he decided that this was great. Somebody would take care of him. As for Barbara, she dismissed it from her mind. She had too many other things to do. And so she said, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. Well, in 1910, Brother Chris was born. Now they've got 5 boys. And when Chris was 2 months old, Pete came to the door with his suitcase. Mom met him and she says, Pete, where are you going? And he said, well, Barbara, remember last year when I was here, you told me if I got sick, you'd take care of me? Well, I just been to the doctor, and the doctor told me I don't have long to live. And here I am. She took a deep breath, thought she was going to faint, and then she thought, you know, I said I'd cross that bridge when I came to it, but she said, I sure didn't think it was this soon. The bridge probably isn't even built. But she said it and she meant it. And she said, Pete, I'll take care of you. And they did. And things were going along quite well, and then Dad and the 5 boys got typhoid fever. Well, Pete was not a bed patient, and he was well enough that he could help Mom take care of these sick people. And they recovered. And when later on, when things were quiet, he said, Barbara, I have something for you. And he gave her a 50-cent piece, and he put it in her hand and closed her fingers over it, and said, keep it, Barbara. Someday it's going to be worth a lot of money. And she said, oh, Pete, she said, nobody's ever given me anything like that before. She said, I'll treasure it always, and I'll put it away for safekeeping, which she did. And then she made another cup of coffee. Well, she noticed that after this, Pete seemed to be failing. He didn't have the spark he had before, and his appetite was diminishing. And she was worried. And then in August of 1910, he died. This was a very traumatic thing. They hadn't experienced this so close, and he was like one of the family. Well, after the service and the grieving was over, they didn't forget him, but life had to go on. She was very busy, and Dad was busy. And then in 1911, the Homesteaders had been in and really talking Homestead to Dad, and he came home all excited. Oh, Barbara, he said, you've got to try this. And she said, what? he called it prove up on a homestead. And she said, well, tell me about it. He said, you have to be a U.S. citizen or intend to be one, and you have to live there for the 5 years. 5 years. You have to build a house on it and till the soil and put in a crop. And could you do that? Could you go out on a homestead? And she said, well, I come this far, Chris. I just said, I'll go the whole way. But she said, you'll have to make all the arrangements. She said, with all these kids, she said, there's no way that I can do anything. So he said that he could do that. He had a helper, so he had more time to spend. And he went out looking for an old house. He knew he couldn't build one. He couldn't afford it. It would take too long. And he's anxious to get out on a homestead. So he found an old 2-story building that he thought he could move. And then he found a smaller house. And he thought he could put it, sort of join this bigger house. It would be kind of like a lean-to. Well, somehow, with the help of, I'm sure, the homesteaders, his friend, and his cousin Tom, they moved the houses out. And she went out to look at it and walked through that old house. And she had to admit that they did a pretty good job. And she thought, well, I think I can make a home here. Her theory was that you filled a house with love, and you had the room of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls and a pot of coffee on the back of the stove, and you could do anything. And she did. So they moved in. They had to get a big water tank because they had to go 6 miles down to Vista to get water. It cost 50 cents. They had to buy the tank, they had the wagon, they had the team. And they had a buggy and a horse because they inherited that from Pete. And then they went to town and bought up staples. They had to buy their flour and sugar and potatoes in large quantities because they were not going to go back and shop very often. And Dad was commuting by train, but not the passenger. He was hopping the rail. He was riding in the boxcar. Now, I don't know why that train stopped in Badger, but it must have, because I think it had broken his neck if he had to jump on it. Mom made 2 sacks for him. She put drawstrings on them, so he could put his groceries that he brought home, just the small things, in this sack. And the other sack he used for his dirty clothes. And then he threw it over his shoulder and walked up the hill 2 miles to the house. The children were always so glad to see him, and so was Mom. He didn't come home even once a week. And you're wondering probably, what do boys do on a homestead? They don't have very many neighbors to play with. However, Henry Smith used to ride his pony down to play sometimes. He lived up on top of the hill. And then, but what they did, they took care of they fed the horses. It was their job to keep the wood box filled. They learned to milk the old cow. They bothered a little lamb. Somebody gave a couple of lambs. And they washed dishes. And they gathered the eggs. But most of all, they liked taking the animals up on the side of the hill to graze. It was virgin land. The bunch grass was beautiful, and a lot of other grasses. And they would jump on these horses. They had 3 horses now, and there were 3 older boys. They jump on these horses. They didn't have a saddle. They didn't use a bridle or a halter. A rope would do it. And they took them up there, they led the old cow, the lambs followed behind, and away they went. This was the land that was a little too steep for Dad to plow, so it was left in the grass. And they loved that. And this was free time for the boys. They worked on their bow and arrows, they made slingshots, they hunted rabbits, and they explored. And one day they found a clam shell out there, so they decided there had to be seawater up there at one time. And sometimes they just laid in the grass with their hands behind their heads and looked at the beautiful sky. It was so blue, and the clouds were so fluffy and pretty, and the air was so clean. And they told each other what they were going to do when they got big. And then they heard the cowbell. And Mom was calling them it was time to come in, but dinner was ready. So they came in, they helped her set the table. But first they brought in some wood, and Rosie gathered the eggs. And then they went in, set the table, had dinner. And after dinner, Bob and Charlie had some homework to do. Yes, they went to school, to a one-room schoolhouse with a teacher who had an 8th grade education. There were about 10 children. They were all children of homesteaders, and they had a wonderful time. And what did these boys wear? They wore big overalls, blue cotton shirts, and in the winter they wore long underwear, the one piece, I think they called them a union suit, and they had a drop seat. And they also wore high-top shoes. And Mom scrubbed these clothes on a board. She had a big tub about like this and a washboard, and she scrubbed those jeans. Can you imagine scrubbing jeans? And she never complained. And then this big old tub served its purpose as a bathtub on Saturday night. And you might wonder how they got their hair cut. They're 13 miles from town, and they certainly not going to take 5 kids in and get their hair cut. They couldn't afford that. Now, my dad was a meat cutter. So he cut their hair. Now, you know, a couple of years ago, the young kids were wearing this bowl cut. My little great-grandson came up. He looked awfully cute with the bowl haircut. Well, I'll have you know that my dad could cut the fanciest bowl cut you ever saw. And then in the summer, when school was out, he gave him a pig shave. And that was cool and nice. They didn't have air conditioning, so that helped. And when summer was over, the hair was grown out, and they were back to the bowl cut. Well, things were going along fine. And then in December of 1912, now you know how old I am, I was born. It was a cold December day, and there snow was on the ground. And you know, the doctor got there, but I didn't bother to ask if he made it on time, or how he knew he was supposed to be there. They had no phones, no way of communicating, and to me it's a real mystery, but that's one of the things I failed to ask. Well, I arrived, and at last they had their little girl. And were they happy? Well, you know, they had mixed emotions about this, because some politician was giving a prize to the woman that would have 6 children. 6 boys. And I had to spoil the prize money. But after the initial shock, they looked at the little sis and they thought, well, you know, sis is going to be around a long time, and that prize money really wouldn't last too long, so it's okay. And they adored me, and they spoiled me, and I loved it. Well, I was about, am I taking too much time?
No. We're enjoying it.
So when I was about 2 years old, Mom went out to get a bucket of water out of the tank, and the tank's empty. Now, somebody didn't do their job. Somebody was supposed to check that water and let them know, but they didn't. And she's pretty upset. She only has enough water in the tea table to make a pot of coffee. To be sure she'd say that. And she thought, what'll I do? And she knew her financial report was bad. But she went in the house and checked her purse, and she didn't have a dime. And she had to have 50 cents to get a tank of water. For a minute she panicked, and then she remembered Pete's 50-cent piece. And she smiled. And she said, boys, I'm going out and hitch up the team. I'm going for water. Now, she didn't tell the boys she didn't have any money because she didn't want to worry them. She went out to the barn and hitched up that team. Now, my mom wasn't a very big lady. And then she came in and she changed her clothes, put on her straw hat, and she was ready to touch her purse, and she was ready to go. She said, boys, I want you to be good. She said, you fix lunch, feed the little ones, and put them to bed for the nap, and I'll be home as quickly as possible. And she said, if you're good, I'll bring you some candy. You know, they bribe the kids in those days. And away she went. She petted the horses as she went by. She said, we're going for water. And then she climbed up on that high seat. That little woman up there in that high seat. And she took the reins and she skidded up and they started down the dirt road. And they're going down a pretty good clip. They're having an empty load. She thought that didn't hurt them. She took the wheels and she saw the dust billowing up and she couldn't help but smile. And she thought, you know, my folks would sure be surprised if they could see me now. They didn't know that she could harness a team of horses, big horses, and go 6 miles for a tank of water, and that she could take care of 6 children and run a 160-acre homestead. She thought, it's a far cry from that dressmaking I did in Denmark. And she thought they'd be proud, and they would. So she hurries down to the station, and pretty soon she's there. And she goes in with all the confidence in the world with her purse clutched in her hand, and she said, Mrs. Carlson, I need a tank of water. She said, but I don't have a 50-cent piece, but I have a rare coin here that's very valuable, and I want to give it to you, and you keep it until I can replace it. Would you do that? Of course. So she got her tank of water, and she said, by the way, could I have a little candy for my children? And she said, yeah. So she gave her some candy, and Mom went out, thanked her kindly, and then she went out, watered her steam, filled up the tank, nuzzled the horses a little bit as she passed, and then she said, we're going home. And she crawled up in that high seat. She didn't have to tell the horses where to go. They knew because it was a frequent trip. And she thought this would be such a nice time. It was hot, but she liked the heat. And she thought, I can give you a chance to count my blessings. And she could just relax. So she counted her blessings. And she thanked the Lord for her hard-working husband, her 6 wonderful children, for the 50 cents that Pete had given her. And she thanked Pete too. And thanked him for the homestead. And she looked at that beautiful sky and those pretty clouds, and she thought, you know, I'm just about the luckiest person in the whole world. It kind of makes me cry. And she went home. And when the children saw her, of course, they ran to meet her. And they piled up on the wagon, rode the rest of the way home. And they helped her unharness the horses, put the horses in the pen. And then they went in, got a bucket of water. She stoked up the fire and made a cup of coffee. We all drank coffee. We always had coffee in the afternoon, even when we were tiny. Didn't spend my girl for dinner. And after they had their candy treat and they had their coffee and their Danish pastry, they said they were going out on the hill. They were going to graze the animals. They loved them. And as they went out, little Harold was left because the little ones were asleep and he wasn't quite big enough to do this. So he said, Mom, when am I going to be big enough to go on the side of the hill? And she said, next year. And she reminded him that this fall he'd be going to school. And then she'd have 4 little children going to school. Do that while we were in school. And so he was satisfied with that and went out to play. And things were going along real well. And the rise up, everything's going great. And then one day, someone brings Dad home in the middle of the day. And he looks so sick. And they have a blanket wrapped around him and he isn't cold. And she thinks, what's wrong? So she said, Chris, what's wrong with you? And he said, oh, Barbara, I've been robbed. What do you mean? So he told her. The night before, he had locked up, and someone came in with a mask and a gun and told him up. And at gunpoint, he said, I want your money. He said, I don't have any. And he said, yes, you do. And he said, you either give me your money or I'm going to tie your arms to the meat grinder. Well, that sounds awful scary to me. And it certainly must have to Dad because he immediately gave me the money. That wasn't so bad. But then he told him, he said, take your clothes off. And when he was stark naked, he threw him in the cooler and latched the door. And of course, he couldn't get out. There was a tiny window up at the ceiling, and he wondered how he would get there. And it was so dark in there, he could hardly see. And he was freezing. He was afraid to try to get out for fear there would be someone that might shoot him when he got out. Maybe he had an accomplice. So he didn't know what to do. His teeth were chattering, and his heart was doing funny things, and his head was splitting. And he thought, I'm going to die, one way or the other, so I think I'll die trying to get out. And he did. He got out. He managed to pile boxes up and finally reached the window, drove it and shimmied down the side. And the front door of the shop was still open. He went in and put on clothes, and then he went to the police station, which was very close. And when they saw the shape he was in, they realized they had to take him home. So someone took him home in a wagon, not in the wagon, in a buggy. It was 13 miles. And there he was. Mom put him to bed, gave him, all they had was Watkins pills. So she gave him a couple of those and made him some hot coffee, heated blankets to try to get him warm, but he was a sick man. They had told the policeman to be sure and call his employee and tell him to keep the market open and he would be in when he could. Well, he couldn't. He couldn't go back for days, and when he finally did, he didn't ride the rails. He took the buggy. And he told Mommy we probably wouldn't be home for a day because he couldn't make the trip, the round trip in one day. And when he finally went down, he realized that he couldn't do it anymore. There'd be no way that he could get on that railroad train or that freight train and then walk up the hill with his groceries. He had to give up his market. So he sold it and bought some land down on the Columbia River. He thought he could probably make a living down there. He knew that he couldn't make a living on the homestead with those 6 kids without a good market. It was a sad day when they had to leave because they loved it. In fact, one day my mother told me that those were the happiest days of her life. And she lived to be 91, so she had a lot of days. But she loved the homestead. They had good times there. Oh, I think I forgot to tell you that for entertainment, Dad played the fiddle and the harmonica. And they pile the kids in the buggy and they go to the neighbors. And he'd entertain them and they'd dance and they'd sing. Play cards and eat and drink coffee. That's how they lived there. And then the neighbors would come to their house. But anyway, they decided that it was time to move. And it was a sad time. And somehow they got their animals down on the river. And that's where we finished growing up. And that's another story. But if you'd like to know what happened to the homestead, it's still out there. It's still in the family. They gave it to me because I was born there, and I'm still paying the taxes. And it looks just like it did when they moved out in 1911. There are no houses. The little buildings are all gone. The outhouses and the fences are all gone. And the land that Dad worked so hard to kill has all grown back to sagebrush, and it looks the same. Maybe there aren't as many rabbits, but otherwise it's the same. And you might wonder what happened to that 50-cent piece. Well, Mom gave it to Brother Harold before she died. And when he died, it became his wife Burles. And when we buried my brother Chris, just 2 weeks ago, and we were reminiscing at the funeral, and I said, "Burl, do you still have the 50-cent piece?" And she said, "Yes." But you know, Joanne, she said, "It isn't worth nearly as much as Mom thought it was." And I said, "I know that." And I think she knew it too. But it was more fun to fantasize and think it was worth a lot of money. And it got her through a couple of real trying experiences. And who knows, when that 50-cent piece is handed down from generation to generation, maybe sometime down the road, it will be worth what Mom thought it was. And then was Pete Manson. When I told Lina Hudson that I would talk about the homestead, I thought I'd got to know something about Pete. See, I didn't know him. He died before I was born. Failed to ask questions. And there was no one left in the family. I'm the only one left. There was no one to ask. So I called Gail Muller at the mortuary and I said, "Gail, when did your grandfather come and start the business?" And she said, "In 1910. Great. I thought, if he could kept good records, we can find out when Pete was born. So she called, put me on hold, and in less than 5 minutes, she said, "Would you believe this? Pete Matson is the 3rd man on Grandpa's books. And he was born December the 9th, day before my birthday. And in 1876. And he died September the 8th, 1910. He was not quite 34, and I thought he was a father figure. My mother was 35, and my dad was 36. They were young, courageous, hard-working Americans, and they planted their roots deep in the Kennewick area. And I was born surrounded by sagebrush, and you know I've lived almost 50 years surrounded by sagebrush just south of town. And if I had my wish, I'll die surrounded by sagebrush. Thank you, and God bless you.